this imperative of simplicity that I want to talk to you about today, what do I mean by this? So my kind of sky is falling hypothesis is that the complexity of our industry and what we do is about to explode, or it is exploding. And I want to talk through kind of some reasons why I think this, which is going to be probably a little bit of preaching to the choir, and it's going to build on some things that you've been hearing all week. And then I want to talk about some ways that I've found that you can deal with some of the complexity that is sort of right around the bend and is also happening right now. So when my fairy godmother whisked me from the world of industrial design into the world of user experience design, it was about 5 years ago, and my life looked something like this. So all of my products, or all of my projects that came to me, the canvas that I was designing to was about like that. And the input that I had to worry about was a mouse and a keyboard. And this was a really big challenge. This was a big deal. And then a couple years into my career, it got spiced up a little bit. There were these projects where the canvas was something like that. And then there were some other projects that would come along where the canvas was more like this, and the input was one of these. So that kind of changed the thinking a little bit. And then just last year, I began to get tasked with projects that the canvas was like this, and like this, and like this. And the inputs that I had to worry about were a mouse, a keyboard, but also this. And this is all in one project and all in one product. And yeah, this made things a little bit more complicated. So on top of this, there's something else right around the corner that Chris was just talking about, is this idea that, and let's go ahead and we'll use the healthcare example because Chris was talking about that, and I've actually met there's a lot of people in the audience that have been doing some really interesting stuff with healthcare. So let's say I design this cross-platform, no platform experience, and say it's like a nutritionist, and or serves as a nutritionist, and you designs another experience. Say it serves as like a personal trainer, and then one of our industrial design, product design friends designs this bike of the future, because this is what the bike of the future is going to look like. And I think you see where this is probably going. The user expectation, and it's happening right now, that the expectation is going to be that all these things are going to talk to each other. So not only are our products going to need to sort of go across all these platforms, they're also going to have to start communicating with each other. So I might be working at one company, and you might be working at another company, and the more we start working together, the more we're going to succeed in these user expectations. And that's going to make things, that's really just going to compound the complexity. And then on top of this, it's really not just going to be bikes and toasters. It's going to be systems, it's going to be buildings, it's going to be large-scale institutions that we're going to have to start talking to and kind of and integrating with. And they're going to have their own systems within. So in the healthcare example, these are going to be hospitals and gyms and even restaurants that we go to, and we're going to have to start integrating with those. And the thing is this is really exciting stuff. I mean, it's definitely a good harbinger of job security, right? I mean, we have our work cut out for us, and it's not boring, and this is all really, really cool stuff. But the thing is, and I'm going to be very transparent here, this is kind of scary to me too, and it's scary because I've never had a project that's easy. And this is not just responsive design projects. Even just status quo projects. And from people that I talk to, I've heard of very few projects that are kind of rainbows and flowers and kittens. Usually, we're being challenged in our work already without any of this extra complexity on top of it. So, like I mentioned earlier, last year I began to get tasked with these cross-platform projects. And the first one that I did was a really, really big deal. It was really super high stakes. It was very high visibility, about 100 million views in one night. And I'm going to talk about the details of the project in a little bit. But for now, I just want to let you know that it did turn out to be a success. We pulled it off, but we pulled it off along with kind of at the stake of just buckets and buckets of blood and sweat and tears. It was really, really difficult. So after the project, I do kind of geek out on process. I like to work smart instead of hard. And I knew I needed to kind of do a retrospective and look at what went right, why did we succeed, what were the things that we did correctly, and what did we do wrong? If I could go back and do this again, how would I do things differently? And this is what I came up with, and this is what I want to talk to you about today. And this has evolved over the past year because I've gone back and tried to implement some of these things. And so they're, but the funny thing about these things is that when I step back and I look at them, I realized, because for a while I was kind of touting as like, oh, this is what you need to do for a responsive design project. And then I realized, oh, this is silly. Like, these are things that you could do for any project. These are just like general best practices that I probably should have been doing all along, but it was the cross-platform sort of responsive nature of the project that was the kind of like the catalyst that made these things an imperative, where before they might have felt kind of more like a luxury. So these are not 5 steps. It's not a process or anything. These are more like principles. They're not in any order. So I'm just going to start with one and talk a little bit more about each of these. So the first one that I want to talk to you about is this idea of actually simplifying your design, aka modular design, aka reduce, reuse, recycle. And for this example, let's say you are designing a product and you're not thinking modularly, and you're not thinking about reducing, reusing, recycling, because we're not really taught to think like that for user experience design. Like we're going to have some digital scraps that are going to the landfill or something. We don't need to worry about it. So we're not thinking modularly. We're not thinking like this. So we go into a project, and on day 1, we're thinking about scenario 1. So we go and we design this little component for scenario 1. And then the next week, we get to another scenario. We get to scenario 2, and so we design this little component for scenario 2. And then a couple days later, we get to scenario 3, and we say, OK, here's another component. And all these components are doing the same thing. Like, let's say they're like a profile object or something like that. So they're all doing the same thing. And then we kind of, later on, if we actually take the time to look back and use the wisdom of hindsight, we might realize that we probably could have just created this one guy and maybe made some rules around it. Maybe we don't even need these rules. Maybe that same object could have been placed in all those scenarios. And the interesting thing about this is reusing that object in all those scenarios potentially, arguably, would make a better user experience because your user can learn to recognize that object over and over again. So for a real-world example of this, remember that cross-platform experience that I was talking about earlier that was a really big deal and it kind of kicked my ass last year? That was the election results for CNN. So I was working with Marissa Gallagher, and who I hope everybody heard her talk on Tuesday. So last year, we got tasked with doing just the election results in an adaptive way. So it was kind of an experiment with really high stakes and really high visibility. And so we did it adaptive. We did it in 3 contained layouts. We had a 12-column and an 8-column and a 4-column, and that was all we were going to worry about. But even with just that, even though it was contained and it was not fully responsive, it was still a completely different way of thinking, for me at least. And it was still a really big challenge, and it kind of blew my mind. So one thing that I think helped us actually succeed in that project was that really early on, we came up with a very simple system. We came up with a system that we could kind of see in our periphery. So this was our sitemap. So it was actually 4 templates, and we just reused those templates over and over again. The 2008 election had about 9 or 10 templates, and we reduced it down to 4. So basically, we had, at the top, you'll see there's Races Main. That was like the homepage for the election results. It was kind of a snapshot. We had a race hub. So there was 5 instantiations of that race hub for president and Senate and House, et cetera. And then we had 50-plus instantiations of the state hub, and that was basically everything about the state. And then the 4th template was a state race detail page, which is basically the intersection of a race and a state. So a race hub would be Senate, everything about the Senate. State hub would be California, everything about California, and a state race detail page would be California Senate, and it would be the more granular details around that. And of course, I mean, there was some variations there. So for the state hub, I mean, we had battleground states, so the battleground states had some like extra bling around them. But for our purposes, at least we could kind of like look back at it and say, you know what, it's not that complicated. We can kind of simplify this. And then as far as the actual pieces that were on those pages, we only had 4 basic modules that we kind of just reused and reshuffled around in these templates. This made up basically 95% of all the content on the page. So we had these summary graphics, and there was a lot of complexity going on within those summary graphics, but just summary graphic, that was one. We had maps, we had data tables, and we had exit polls. And that's it. So yeah, the maps, there was a lot we had to think about with those maps. But we could kind of box it in, at least, and contain that problem, and just think about how all the pieces work together. So for the map, of course, we had to think about, so how does the flyout work on a tablet phone, or how does a user pinch and zoom? So we're going to have to hide the little plus and minus buttons because that only makes sense on desktop. So there's all these questions that we did have to answer, but really, we could at least say there's only 4 main pieces. So number 2, this idea of simplifying your team. So my biggest fear is that when kind of complexity comes to town, managers and directors are going to just, so to speak, throw more bodies at it. And often I believe that this is not the right thing to do. So yes, sometimes teams are understaffed sometimes. I'm sure everybody's been on a project where you feel like you need more help. But I think more often teams are overstaffed and under-teamworked or something. So what I'm proposing here, what this kind of overlap is representing is a couple things. So number 1, it's representing proximity. So yes, I know that sometimes you're working with people that are on the other side of the world, but when you can, if you guys are in the same building, or at least you're in the same city, try to get in the same room. And not only get in the same room, but kind of like lean over each other's shoulders and get in each other's bubble, and get to that point where you have that level of comfort and you have that level of trust, and you're physically and mentally close to those people on your team. And the second thing is overlap in skill set. So learning more about what everybody else is doing on your team, and not only gaining appreciation for what they're doing and hoping to gain appreciation for what you do, but also actually learning a little bit of that stuff. And that sort of leads me into another piece, which is learning, not only sharing skill sets, but actually sharing tool sets. So we're going to get down in the weeds just a little bit with this, but this is the idea. Right now, I'm sure most of you, all these sort of disciplines are kind of all working in different tools. So the visual designers are working in Photoshop or Illustrator. The business analysts are working in Word documents and Excel documents. User experience designers, we're working in something like OmniGraffle or Balsamiq or Axure, and our developers are working in code. So we're not overlapping our tools. And this is something that we're actually trying to experiment with at Engage right now. So I've used Axure for a while. I'm kind of a little bit of an Axure evangelist. I really like the tool. But I've always sort of worked in it by myself. And then I hand off the wireframes. So what we're experiencing right now is I'm working with some really, really great business analysts. And those business analysts have actually agreed to learn Axure. And we're sharing a document, and they're actually coming in, and I know we definitely, I agree with what Lane was saying earlier today about the least common denominator of documentation, but the situation that we're living right now is that our client really wants the end product to be very well documented and annotated, and that is our reality right now. So what we're doing is our business analysts are learning Axure, and they're taking 50 pages of Excel requirements, functional requirements, and about, 15 different Word documents, and they are working to distill those documents down and having additional interviews with the client and interviews with users and gathering more requirements and trying to take those things and funneling it into the tool that I am wireframing in, which is, I've never experienced this before. It is kind of an experiment, but I'm really, really excited about it. And so far, it's going very well, so I can report back later on how that goes. So to shift gears a little bit, let's talk about priorities. And we have a little bit of priority inception now. So there's two pieces to this idea of prioritization. So the first piece is that let's say we create this product, and this is sort of an imaginary product with these three main functional pieces. We have browse, create, and manage. And definitely go with your team and brainstorm and come up with that dream product and all your ideas, and diverge and converge and do your brainstorming. Do your due diligence to figure out what this thing can be, but don't get too attached to it. We all need to get really, really good at ruthless elimination, led by kind of razor-sharp prioritization skills. We need to get good at figuring out what that minimal viable product should be by really understanding the core goals of the business that of our client, our own business, and also our users. So translating that understanding into really great prioritization skills. What should that phase one look like? And also get good at communicating and selling this decision, and getting consensus on that minimal viable product, making sure everybody's on board that, yes, this is what we're going to try to go out of the gate with. So the second part of that prioritization principle comes after you have that minimal viable product. So after we've defined the minimal viable product, we need to focus on defining hierarchy. And this might get a tad bit controversial, but I really believe that we're going to move away from wireframes as we know them. So we've heard this mobile-first discussion, and this is definitely something that I believe in, but I would even take it a step further to say, I think we're going to need to move to more of a mobile-only wireframe. Maybe it's more of a hierarchy diagram. So I think that we're going to have to lean a lot more on our visual design and front-end development counterparts to figure out layout. I don't think we're going to have the time or the mental capacity capacity to be worrying about whether something's going to be a right column or a left column, or even whether something that we need some progressive disclosure for is going to be some beautiful overlay that comes up, or is it going to be an expand and collapse thing. I just think that we're going to need to lean on the people that do that better than us. And we need to worry more about what is the prioritization of the pieces on the page? What is the prioritization of those pages? So, number 4, iterate on fidelity, not on functionality. So what do I mean by this? So for an example, a little bit more inception for you, just an example of going through the process of creating the assets for this talk and figuring out how I was going to say what I was trying to say. So I started off, you can see my cat more than you can see the whiteboarding behind it, but the first thing I did is I just scribbled it out. I whiteboarded it, how I wanted to try to get my points across. And then I took that, and then I whiteboarded it again, and then again. And then when I finally kind of got that in a good place, I created some note cards. And I drew little sketches on the note cards. And then I took the note cards into Keynote and just put them in the notes in Keynote. And then it wasn't until like the end of last week that I actually started creating the visuals. So what I didn't do is I didn't go and whiteboard step 1, or the principle number 1. So I didn't whiteboard everything about modular design and then make note cards about everything about modular design and then type it up and then make the visuals and then go to step 2 and then go to step 3. No, I was thinking about it holistically. And that's probably how a lot of you work when you're actually doing your design work. So to go back to our this imaginary product with these 3 sort of distinct areas of functionality. So we've done this, and we've done this through brainstorming and figuring out our minimal viable product. And what I've seen happen before is we get some agile product manager in here. And what they end up doing is they very proudly label sprints like this. And they say, oh, that makes sense. Let's do browse first and then create, and then we're going to do manage, because they go into these nice, neat little buckets. And on the surface, this kind of makes sense. Like, okay, maybe. But the problem is at the end of the first sprint, what do you have to test? You can test the browse piece, but the browse piece is not the minimal viable product. You need all 3 pieces for the actual, to feel it out, to see like what is this thing supposed to do? How does it feel? Is my system working? You can't test that until you get to sprint 3. And then the other problem is what happens is you get to this create piece, and once you get there, you realize, and you start getting down into the details with everything about create, you realize, oh, there's probably some things about browse, some of those details that I want to change now that I know what I know about create. But that ship has already sailed. I mean, it's done. So maybe you'll get to it in like a backlog sprint or something like that. So instead, I'm recommending dividing up your sprints a little bit more like this. So actually iterating on fidelity. So sprint 1, all you do is you just lay the foundation of that minimal viable product in development. And this might mean that you have a lot of placeholders, or just the entire thing is just all placeholders that maybe are color-coded or something. But then when you get to the end of sprint 1, then you can start playing with it. And if you need to pivot, then it's a lot easier to pivot because you haven't done any detail work yet. So finally, 30 seconds. So the last piece I want to talk about is kind of the piece that just makes everything else possible. And so this is this idea of making time for everything, making time for simple. So what has happened to me in the past is that I get brought on really late, maybe like a week and a half before development starts or something like that. And it's this mad scramble. And the project manager says to me, don't worry about it. It's okay. We only need final wireframes for browse. So just worry about that browse piece, and then while we're developing browse, then you can be working on create. And what that does is that creates that sort of non-modular, myopic thinking that leads you to have all these extraneous parts that I was talking about in that first principle. Because what you do is you just think about the one piece and then the other piece and then the next piece. So this is kind of a call to action to have whatever you want to call it, like a UX waterfall before your sprint start, or a double or even a triple sprint zero, to sort of make time for that. And I know it's a very kind of novel and original concept that's probably blowing your mind right now. But I think that it's really important, and I know that for a lot of people in the room, it's out of your control. But and I actually, I hate to say it, but even though it's out of your control, I mean, do what you can. Fight tooth and nail. Try to educate the people around you that you do need that time to do that UX discovery, do your research, and create that modular design, even if it is at a very kind of low fidelity. But what you've done is you've reduced your templates, you've reduced your modules, you've created a simple system, and once you create that simple system and that good hierarchy, then the rest of your job is easier. Then it's just spackling in all the details. So, and I do hate to say it, I mean, if you cannot convince your directors, your project managers, and it just doesn't make sense to have this extra time, I would even say, like, front load your project. I mean, work a little bit of overtime so you don't have to work as hard later when all these changes come up. So, again, these are the principles that I found that can kind of infuse your actual product and your process with simplicity, and I hope maybe you got a few crumbs of insight and that can actually help infuse your day with a little bit more sanity. Thank you.